Today's podcast is with myself, Kyle Conrad. Tim is out of town. He's at an event in New York City, and so we're improvising here and trying to just keep the podcast going and keeping ourselves accountable to releasing some material every week. And so this week, what I'm going to talk about is the top 8 things that I've learned by doing this podcast over the past year. We've done 34 episodes so far, and we've been recording, different conversations for about a year now. And so it's been a lot of fun. It's been an experiment. Really haven't had a plan the whole time. Still don't really have a plan, but we find it interesting, rewarding, challenging. We learn a lot about ourselves, and we learn a lot about the people that we interview. And so I just wanted to go through today and talk about kind of the, I wouldn't say necessarily top 8, but 8 things that I've learned or realized through our conversations with different folks. It might be an interesting fact about that person or some experience that they've had in life. And so that's what today's episode is about. So I'm going to start off with podcast number 2 was with David Baldwin, Tim's younger brother. And one of the things I found really interesting, I've always found it interesting with Tim, and I think David, hit the nail on the head, so to speak, and also even elaborated on some of the thoughts and items that I've picked up over the years and spending time with Tim, is the difference between being homeschooled and going to a traditional school, if you will, and being surrounded by other kids and growing up kind of in the traditional school system. So minute 730 in the David Baldwin podcast, or the podcast with him rather, we talk about how kids that were homeschooled seem to pick up things or can pick up things really, really quickly. They're forced to be super self-reliant. They don't have a teacher in a lot of ways. They have to self-teach, and so they read through the lesson plan like a teacher would. And then once they go through the lesson plan, then they have to teach the material to themselves. A lot of times they have parents or other folks, adults, that are helping them, but it's not, you don't have a teacher for 8 hours a day. And so David elaborates during this podcast about how, he was very self-reliant and could, teach himself something really quickly because he was forced to be engaged. And so that engagement kind of turned his brain on, if you will, and he wasn't relying on somebody else to teach him something. He wasn't relying on his teachers, and his teachers were not a crutch, so to speak. So I've always thought that was really interesting. And David had an experience where, up until 6th grade, he was homeschooled, and after 6th grade, he was in the traditional school system. And he talks about the pros and cons of both. And so super interesting. It starts at minute 730 with podcast number 2 with David. Another one I have listed here is podcast number 3, which is our second podcast with Liz Baldwin, Tim's mom. And at minute 1730, we talk about selling raw milk. This is something that I don't have any experience with. Tim grew up on a dairy farm. Him and his mom and his family ran a dairy farm for a long time. And ultimately, the last few years of when the farm was operational, Liz was selling raw milk, and so we talk about that. We talk about uh, some of the health benefits that raw milk can have, and potentially, some of the flaws that, maybe raw milk could have. And so Liz kind of explains the challenges with a regulatory agency that is trying to regulate farms across the state of New York, and how that becomes really challenging for small operations. Small operations don't have the means to buy, or build expensive infrastructure or equipment, and so the regulations in her mind, um, are like a one size all fits all approach, and that doesn't really work. And so we talk about that. Um, Liz kind of gives a brief explanation of the difference between organic and raw. Very, very different. Organic milk is pasteurized and homogenized. The milk that we all buy in the store is also pasteurized and homogenized. Um, and and so Liz kind of has an opinion, and I think a really interesting one about the benefits of not homogenizing and not pasteurizing milk. Basically getting it directly from the cow, raw, and in a clean environment, in a sanitized environment, and then very quickly, within about an hour, getting it down to, I think it was 37 degrees is what she mentioned. And so getting it down to temperature. And so in that way, doing it in a safe, clean environment, raw milk can be super healthy for people. It has a lot of enzymes in it, and that we don't get through regular milk that we get at the store because of the homogenized and pasteurized processes. So that was an interesting one. The next one is podcast number 11 with Tori Pintar, minute 37. This is an interesting one. I think everybody has experiences like this in life, and we all have different ones. There might be, I'm sure there's some themes, but one of the themes that Tori talked about that stuck with me and I remember is, she talked about the shame of as an adolescent and as a young woman, the shame of having sex for the first time, or drinking for the first time, and experimenting with drugs. And how that shame is carried with her for a really long time. And, as an adult, she's had to work through that. And her body feels a certain way about something, but that's really from childhood. Even though now as an adult, she knows that there's nothing wrong with having sex. There's nothing wrong with drinking. There's nothing wrong with the recreational drug use, as long as you'll say, that you're, I guess functioning, in the world properly, and not abusing those things, if you will. And so she's talked about she's had to fight through that, and kind of shake the shame off, if you will. So that was something that stuck with me. It's something that I often think about with people that I neither know well or that I newly meet, depending on, if you're having a detailed conversation of like, what's their past life like, and how does something like that relate to how they think and how they feel. In that same kind of vein, Tori talks about, the importance of figuring out who you are, what you think, what you want in life, and how to navigate that. It's a really tough challenge to kind of shake those things off from the past. So that was a good segment there. Insightful segment with Tori. Another one was with Bailey Evans, podcast number 12. Bailey kind of dives into her value system just a little bit, kind of on the surface, what she values in life. She talks about how she picked up um, this idea of knowing what your values are and staying within those brackets or boundaries of your values. And when you're not within those boundaries of your values, pay attention to that. Pay attention to how you feel, and keep yourself accountable. So she talks about allowing yourself to um, allowing yourself some balance with that, right? So there may be something that you're trying to accomplish in life that is that pushes up against your boundaries of your values, and so you need to balance that. And so what she talks about is, in the last year and change or so, she's been working really hard, and she's had some financial goals with her and her husband, and or her and a fiance husband. I'm not sure if they got married yet, but and how one of her main values is spending time with people who she really cares about, and making sure that she's highly engaged and involved in those people's lives. And so she's been working a lot, and working probably more than she would have liked, and maybe she's been unbalanced. And so she talks about allowing yourself some grace, but also keeping yourself accountable, and and finding that balance. The next one is podcast number 13 with Srinivasa Nukala. And in this podcast, we talk about, Serini grew up in India and migrated to the U.S. During college. And so one of the things that I learned, and I'm sure Tim learned as well, was how competitive it can be in different places around the world, specifically India, to get a high quality education. In particular, in this conversation, really the conversation was around, competition for the same resources in a highly populated place, where the demand for those resources are is extremely high. And so Srini talks about, when he was about 12 years old, it was predetermined that he would become an engineer. And so from then on, children in India focus on their education in that field. And so they are moving towards a clear vision and a clear goal of, hey, I'm going to be an engineer when I grow up. So they don't, at least the way Serini described it, is they don't go to college and then try to select a major and then change a major when they get there. They pick something when they're quite young, and they work towards it, and that's what they go do. And so Srini went to the Indian Institute of Technology, and he talks about the application process and kind of the testing process, if you will, to get in. And so that testing process starts at 400,000 applicants. And then they ultimately break it down to 2,500 people. So 2,500 people get selected, and those people are, ranked in from 1 to 2,500. And so the first person who gets in, really gets the very first choice, or the first person that's ranked gets the very first choice. And then the person down to the 2,500 person, obviously gets the kind of what's left over, if you will, in the last choice. And so that was super interesting to me. I think kids in the U.S. Or probably around the world think that it's hard to get into college. And that just, for me, took it to a whole another level. When you're applying against 400,000 other people, and then only 2,500 people are going to get in, that's quite extreme. So really interesting piece of information there. Sereni's a super interesting guy, has kind of a really cool, special background. So recommend you check that one out. The next one was podcast number 19 with Ben Bessie. Ben talks about the importance of learning something new and keeping your mind strong. And so, he talks about building and strengthening your attention span by learning new things. So that might be reading a book. It might be picking up a new hobby, and really building that endurance in your mind. Ben talks about the hours in a day and the importance of not wasting time and building a discipline over time. So, look at your discipline over a course of years. And it might be 5 years or 10 years, and how much can you accomplish over a really long period of time if you just get a little more disciplined, little by little, and the endurance and strength of your mind will build over time. So I just think that's a really interesting thought. What could you possibly accomplish 10 years from now if you just did a tiny bit every day, every week, every month? So interesting idea there. Another one here was with my brother, Cole Conrad. This was at about minute 155 in, so really towards the end. We were talking about Cole's career, and after a few years of working at Milwaukee Tools, Cole describes himself as being unsettled in his life, and he didn't know where he wanted to go. He didn't really have a clear direction, but he knew that what he was doing at that time wasn't where he wanted to be, and wasn't what he was doing. And so talks about kind of that disruptive period of time in his life and in his career. And I think I would imagine that a lot of people struggle with that. And it's a really hard time because you don't have any direction. And so Cole talks a little bit about that. Found that really interesting, that he still has the same boss that he had 12, 13 years ago, and they really get along. But that was a time when his boss had mentioned to him and said, "Hey, Cole, I think this is a time in your life that you're unsettled." And so interesting. I think a lot of young people in their first 5 years of their career, they're very unsettled. They're kind of bouncing off the guardrails, trying to figure out where they want to go, where they fit in. And I think it's a vulnerable and learning time for a lot of young adults, kind of figuring out their place in the world and their place in their career. And then another one here was podcast number 26 with our buddy Greg. And a really cool takeaway that I had with Greg was at about an hour 25 in, Greg talks about a strategy that he has in place that he uses to identify kind of challenges in his life and kind of work through them. And so whenever Greg is running up against something in life and he can't really identify what it is, he takes a moment and he divides up kind of things into 4 quadrants. One is family, one is friends, one is his job, and the other one is himself. And so he asks himself, like, what's bothering me? Like, is it something wrong with my family? Is it something wrong with my friends? Or is it something at my job or at work? Or is it something with himself? And so I thought it was a really good strategy to kind of isolate and identify, the problems in your life or what might be bothering you. So then you can put a plan together to take action to solve it. Instead of kind of spin and not identify it. I think that's a really good way to identify that. So that was a really good one as well. That's really it. So I know there's a whole bunch more, but kind of short staffed today and this week. I've been traveling, been on the road, and so is Tim. So um, hope that you guys are enjoying the podcast. Tim and I are having a really good time doing it. It's a lot of work with what else we got going on in life, but it's a lot of fun, and we're going to continue to kind of work at it little by little. So thanks for listening. We really appreciate it. Hope you can kind of tell, little by little that we're getting a tiny bit better as we go. And have a great day. Thanks a lot.